We're going to slow things down here on the last leg of Hillcrest Road so that we can do a couple deep dives. One, a lot more deeper than the other, so let's get moving. I said earlier that not everyone who lives in the Hollywood Heights is your, stereotypical Hollywood Hills rich person. There are a lot of renters, and there are also some pretty small multi-family homes. The house on the other side of these hedges is not one of them. It's a huge 4,700 square foot house with 5 bedrooms and a great pool with an amazing view. Unlike the one we have right now, we're going to see some other angles of it. I'll walk up Glencoe Way here a bit so we can see the top of it sticking out, but I just looked it up quickly, and apparently it last sold in 2018 for $4.3 million, which doesn't really corroborate the neighbor who just told me that a current movie and TV star lives here, because the person they said didn't really come on the scene until 2020, and I can't see her buying a house like this before that. Anyway, this is not TMZ. On this show, we are going to go way back into the past. From here on Glencoe Way, we can kind of see the top of the house. Okay, well, now this feels like TMZ. Slightly paparazzi-ish, but now you can get a better idea of what the Dunning family called Casa Mia when it was built for them in 1929. Mr. Carroll H. Dunning, he was a cinematographer who founded the Dunning Color Corporation with the help of his son Dodge. I read all about it, and honestly, the details, they went in one ear and out the other too, because I did not understand any of it. It was all very scientific. Basically, they, invented a process that had something to do with the way lighting was used in black and white movies. I didn't really retain what I read about it, but I do remember that Mr. Dunning mentioned that a trick he used to simulate a blizzard for a scene was cornflakes, ground up cornflakes, and thrown into a wind machine. He also said that oil sprayed through atomizers could create a foggy look. Then I think he went on to, develop something that processed film for color, which paved the way for films being shot in color. I know, very important, but not entirely sure what his company did. But the most important part is that it afforded them this mansion, and I'd rather talk all about the great dinner parties that Mrs. Dunning Mary threw, like the one in January of 1929, where everyone played bridge amongst a red color theme. Oh, she arranged poinsettias and gladiolas and roses all throughout the house, but get this, she didn't serve her buffet dinner until midnight. That's what the paper said. How long did the bridge games go? And how late did people stay? Must have been late, because she served them cake and bonbons, all red, of course. The following month, Mary traded red for pinks and blues when she threw a Valentine-themed bridge party. No word on whether or not she starved her guests till midnight, though. Maybe they were after parties, like all the flappers went to the clubs and then came back to Mary and Carol's for food, fun, and who knows what else. In the spring of 1930, the Dunnings, they had a more serious affair when they hosted a dinner party honoring royalty. Prince and Princess Friedrich Christian Schomburg-Lippe, along with a few close friends, He was a German prince, apparently. His family, they ruled a state or a principality in Germany named after the family called Schaumburg-Lippe. It apparently dissolved in the mid-1940s, though. The Dunnings appeared many, many, many times in the social pages of the newspapers, not just for their lavish parties, but anytime they'd travel, like in 1931 when the press announced that they were returning here to their home after a 5-month trip abroad. Seemed to be a really big thing in the 20s and 30s, just everyone announcing where they were going and for how long they would be gone. I just hear, so come rob our home. People would come home and be like, our stuff is gone now. How did that happen? There's a really cool view around this corner because not only can we see the house better, but you get an idea of why exactly it's called Hillcrest. And all those places we saw up there, starting with Patrick Swayze's house, they're all just pretty parallel to this house here, and they just shoot all the way up that hill. Can't see any of them because they're aligned with this one. Anyway, in addition to their son Dodge, the Dennings had a daughter named Decla. She was a junior at the University of California who joined them all on that 1931 trip. Decla, though, she considered herself more of a bohemian and loved to travel. She didn't really have her mother's flair for party throwing, even though she did begin hosting her own events here at home and around town. But it was Decla's wedding in 1934, right here in the living room of this house, that was the talk of the neighborhood. Now a graduate of UCLA, she married John Runyon, who came from a family from Altadena. The ceremony was reported on in great detail. They mentioned the window at the end of the long living room and how it was completely hidden by a wall of white sweet peas that stretched from the ceiling to the floor, and how the room was stuffed with clusters of white billowy chrysanthemums while a tall white candelabra provided the light. Real romantic fairy tale kind of wedding. But after their honeymoon, they returned here to the house around the same time her parents, Mary and Carroll, were returning from a trip visiting friends in England, and guess what Mary did? Oh yeah, she threw a party for them and 20 other guests. Ugh, I want to go to a party in the 1920s and 30s so bad, but I want to eat at like 9 at the latest. 3 years after her marriage, Decla gave birth to a son, Richard Runyon. She also became a journalist at the LA Times, and in 1939 wrote a piece on Orson Welles, a profile story. It's a really nice, in-depth look at the life of one of Hollywood's most influential and talented filmmakers. And what's crazy about Decla interviewing him for the piece is that 7 years later, she would be one of the screenwriters of a film that Orson directed, 1946's The Stranger. He also starred in the movie alongside Loretta Young and Edward G. Robinson. 1946, it also happened to be the year that Decla and John got divorced. She actually made the transition from journalist to screenwriter 2 years prior to working with Orson Welles. Her first screenplay was 1944's The Hairy Ape, based on the Eugene O'Neill play of the same name. And working with Welles, it didn't exactly turn her into a well-known screenwriter. She only wrote a few more scripts for film and television up until about 1956, but she didn't stop writing. She wrote for newspapers and magazines, most notably as a contributor to The New Yorker. The year after she collaborated with Welles, she went on a blind date with a man named Paul Rabin. They fell in love instantly and married the following year in 1948. Guess where? Yeah, here in this house where Mom and Dad were still living. I mean, is that even allowed? Both of your weddings in the same house? That's not like bad luck. Well, Paul didn't seem to really mind, I suppose. After all, it was also his second wedding. But my favorite thing about their marriage is that they were all set to go to Hawaii, but at the last minute decided to spend their money on a new house in Toluca Lake, not that far from here. They told the newspaper that they thought it would be more fun to have their own terrace to sit on where they could think about Hawaii. Paul, he was in the movie business. At one time, he was a talent agent, but he mostly worked in the advertising department. Oh, he's credited with launching the advertising campaign that launched the career of our dear, dear, dear friend, Hedy Lamarr. It was all part of the release of Algiers, in which she co-starred with our other dear, dear, dear friend and Hollywood Heights resident, Sigrid Guri. But shortly after their marriage, Paul ventured into a production company with actor Yul Brynner. The newlyweds, they didn't have a whole lot of time together on that new terrace of theirs because they actually spent the 50s and 60s and 70s pretty much living abroad and traveling for film shoots. They didn't just live in Europe, they lived in Africa, where Paul produced 1966's Born Free, which was adapted from the best-selling book, and filmed mostly in Kenya. That movie actually won the Oscar for Best Music, and Paul actually accepted the award. The couple, they'd also live in Russia while they made a 1976 film called The Bluebird, starring Elizabeth Taylor. It was actually the very first film collaboration between the United States and Russia, but backing up, it was 7 years after Decla and Paul were married that their beloved socialite mother Mary passed away on September 19th, 1955, ending nearly 3 decades worth of life and memories together in this home. And Mary's husband, Carroll, Decla's father, he moved away from here and lived for quite some time, passing away on December 1st, 1975, at the ripe old age of 94. This is a wild little tidbit as we end the Dunning family story. Carroll, he actually lived long enough to see his grandson Richard become an extremely successful graphic designer and advertising whiz. In 1973, Richard created the very first logo for FedEx, back when it was known as Federal Express. You might actually remember it because that logo actually lasted until 1994 when the company changed to the one that we're all so familiar with today. The Dunning patriarch was, however, just 5 years shy from seeing Decla publish her first novel, called Simon's Wife, described as an exotic and erotic story about marriage set in the backdrop of Africa. I wonder where she got that inspiration from. Sadly, though, it was around this time that she was diagnosed with macular degeneration, and within 2 years, she was completely blind. The Los Angeles Times, they did a big story on her and how she drew support from her beloved Paul and how she was using humor and laughter to cure and heal herself. She said she had admittedly been suicidal, but that she decided to look at her new challenge as an adventure. Sadly, though, that adventure only lasted about 2 years. She passed away at the age of 74 on March 27th, 1984. And Paul and Decla, they were married for 36 years. And I'm not judging. It's just surprising that he got married 7 months later, but good for him. He actually went on to live for quite a while. He continued to produce. His last movie was 1996's The Ghost in the Darkness, starring Michael Douglas and the late, great Val Kilmer. That was also filmed in Kenya. But Paul, he passed away on October 18th, 2001 at the age of 88, and this is just so terrible. Just under a month later, on November 13th, his stepson, Richard, the logo designer for FedEx, died when the small plane he was flying mysteriously crashed upon takeoff in Santa Monica. And Richard, who shared a middle name in honor of his grandpa Carroll and who grew up visiting his grandparents here in their home, was 63. Here we have another one of those common Hollywood Hills situations, the sort of double address thing. Technically, the house behind this fence up on the hill is a Hillcrest house, but they park and enter up around the corner on Glencoe Way. We actually walked by the entrance. It's a few doors down from the abandoned Frank Lloyd Wright house. And you know what would be fun about living in this house? Nothing at all. Could you imagine the Abbott and Costello who's on first routine that you would have to do every time you ordered something or had someone over? No, I'm sure it's lovely. It looks really peaceful up there. That's a 3-bedroom, 2,100 square foot house built in 1930, peeking out. In 1953, Mrs. Hazel Smith was living in it when she won a mink stole, some sort of prize over at an event held at the Gilmore Field where CBS Television City and the Farmers Market now sit, which, of course, you can see in my tour of Gene Spangler. You thought I was going to say Carol Burnett, didn't you? All right, fine, it's in that one too. It's just bonkers to me that in addition to the newspapers telling everyone when a resident would be out of town, that they would also print the address of prize winners. Not just Hazel's mink stole, but I've seen hundreds of cases where the papers will be like, Mr. Crawford won a cash prize of $2,000, and this is where he lives. Anyway, not much excitement to report about this triplex built in 1954. Or really, the house directly across from it, a 2,100 square foot 3-bedroom house, which was built in 1923. And I'm sure that they wouldn't mind if you found out that they won a big cash prize. Certainly doesn't look like anyone's getting over that prison fence. If we kind of get a little bit closer, you can get an idea of its craftsman style architecture, which is pretty similar to the one right next door to it. So check it out here because we won't really see any of it next door. They have opted for a more fortress style of protection. And their 1,700 square foot house, it's even older. It was built in 1917. Same as its address. And how creepy is this? Don Ellis, a 23-year-old singer, he was living here in 1945 when he stopped into a cocktail bar on Hollywood Boulevard to have a drink while he waited for his girlfriend to get off work. She worked at a nearby theater. And Don, he told the police that when he got up to go to the bathroom, a tall stranger in a dark coat followed him. Once inside the bathroom, the stranger said to Don, "Oh, here you are," and then proceeded to stab him repeatedly in the left arm. Don managed to fight the man off and escape, but police never found his assailant, and Don, he never found out who the guy was either. Also, there's a well-known jazz trumpeter named Don Ellis, but this was not him. But how about the Sky Apartments, a 20-unit apartment complex built in 1961, and one of the first tenants was Robert Lee. He entered the Citizen News Oscar contest pretty much every year that he lived here. He was a runner-up in 1963, and in 1967, he won 3rd place. His prize, you couldn't come steal that. It was a 2-night stay at the Riviera Hotel in Las Vegas, but not only that, he was given a brand new 1967 Buick Riviera to drive there and back. The first place prize, by the way, was a trip for 2 to Peru. Geesh, bring back the Citizen News Oscar contest, please. Oh, I am so excited now because we have reached an absolute gem of a place, one of my top 5 favorites on this entire Hollywood Heights tour. Not only because it's just gorgeous and very unique back there. Well, out here too. I love how the green garage door matches the beautiful landscaping, but I also love it because of who used to live here. Someone who I love so much that I actually wrote a letter to the current residents, and thanks to them, we're going to get to see a much closer look. It's pretty special back there. This property might seem pretty simple if you were to just breeze by it. You'd never know that it was called the Highland Estates, nor that there were 3 very large Victorian craftsman bungalows back there. Unless maybe you noticed the multiple addresses above the front gate there. Each of the 3 bungalows, they're duplexes, and they were built between 1912 and 1915, well over 100 years worth of history. A character actor named Carroll Naish lived in bungalow number 1916 during the 1930s. He is a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame for having acted in over 200 films, receiving 2 Oscar nominations in the process. He was born in New York City, but he played characters that were American, Middle Eastern, Indian, Asian. He was known for playing all sorts of ethnicities, something that Hollywood now gets called out for doing, but he made a great living doing it. There have been a ton of show business people who have called this place home, but we are going to focus on bungalow 1914. It's the front one right here, which we can kind of see through the gate. We're going to get a lot closer to it a little later. I want to save it for when I get to the person I love so much. We're actually going to stay outside while I talk about all of the other people who lived here long before she moved in. Like the very first people to live in 1914 when it was completed in 1912. They were Mr. and Mrs. Davison. The 50-year-old groom and his younger bride moved in here after they spent their honeymoon driving through Southern California. They were only 1 year into their marriage when Mr. Davison was wanted for forgery and embezzlement of over $60,000 that he swindled from his clients. But this is actually an exciting embezzlement story because, well, he tried to elude the police, and there were even stakeouts right out front here. The prestigious Pinkerton Detective Agency even got involved. They camped right out here on Hillcrest, just waiting to make their move. Mr. Davison worked in real estate, and he would put those ads in the paper disguising his scams as big opportunities to make an easy return on your investment, you know, those types. Well, enough people started filing complaints after falling for those ads, saying that he never delivered on his promise. So a warrant was issued and police made their move. Well, he was actually staying at his uncle's, the detectives found out, so they left their stakeout here and arrested him over at his uncle's place, but when they took him downtown, all hell broke loose. Now, you might think that 60 grand isn't all that much, but back then it was a fortune, and it was amassed from over 80 clients. And more than half of them were screaming in the hallways of the police station that afternoon that their con artist got arrested. Oh, they were irate, they wanted their money back, and Mr. Davison just maintained his innocence, saying it was all a misunderstanding and that he would get them their money as soon as he could. Even Mrs. Davison stood by her man and defended him. She gave this incredible sob story about how her husband was such a good man and that they only took money from his clients to save his ex-wife, who apparently couldn't pay her medical bills. I don't know. She begged the police to release him from jail, but they didn't. And in a wild plot twist, he actually confessed, and his confession letter made the front page news, and in 1914, they sent him to San Quentin prison to serve out a 3-year sentence. Oh, and Mrs. Davison, well, she said screw that and filed for divorce as soon as her husband was locked up. Let's talk about the 3 Mrs.'s who occupied 1914 after the Davisons fled in shame. The first Mrs. Mildred Miles, the marvelous Mrs. Mildred Miles, she had to be just flying down Beverly Boulevard in 1925 when she collided with Wesley Holler, who was sent careening through his windshield 13 feet through the air. He only suffered minor injuries, though, and Mildred, well, she was out of here 2 years later and 1927, when new bride Mrs. Jean Ferguson moved in with her new husband. Their wedding, and really all of the festivities leading up to it, were played out all across the newspapers. I'm not sure how long they lived here, but I tracked Mrs. Ferguson down and am happy to report that she had a long life, passing away at the age of 95 in 2002. And remember Mrs. Betty Gay, the one who lived down on Camrose in the 1930s? Well, in 1946, there was a Mrs. Charles Gay, and she was living here. And they both gave wedding receptions. Gays and their party throwing. Endless fun. Mrs. Gay and her husband, they threw a party here inside of 1914 on behalf of their bride-to-be daughter, Gloria Gay. Ooh, just a nur away from being Gloria Gaynor. And ironically, Gloria Gay, she majored in music over at Hollywood High. So I have about an hour before meeting the current residents of 1914, who are kind enough to let us get a closer look. So in the meantime, let's finish Hillcrest Road, and then I'm gonna sit in the park directly across the street and talk about the actress, one of the greatest to ever do it, who lived in 1914. On the corner of Hillcrest Road and Bonita Terrace, 1 block north of busy Franklin Avenue, sits one of the largest residential complexes in Hollywood Heights. It also marks the flattest part of Hollywood Heights, which, combined with the building, I think it gives it more of an urban feel. It's also directly across the street from a church, and wow, is it something to look at. Just beautiful. Has that great old school Hollywood charm and glamour about it. And it has quite a pedigree to go along with it. A quick internet search of the building will tell you that Errol Flynn and Francis Ford Coppola each lived here at one point. However, I was not able to find any proof to back up the Errol Flynn claim, but as for Coppola, he apparently stayed here for a very brief time while he was in town filming his 1992 film, Bram Stoker's Dracula, starring 3 showbiz favorites of mine, Winona Ryder, Keanu Reeves, and Anthony Hopkins. His place, it was apparently on the 3rd of the 7 floors that this building holds. His was one of 18 apartments that made up LA architect Frank Webster's design, which eventually became this building in 1929. It's called the Villa Bonita, and in 1986 it was added to the National Register of Historic Places, and Wikipedia will tell you that Frank Webster designed it for Sidney Ullman, the agent and manager for film superstar Rudolph Valentino, and that he built it to house Cecil B. DeMille and his crew of movie makers. It's simply not true. For starters, Valentino's manager was named George Ullman, not Sidney. 2 completely different men. Sidney was an art director who worked on The Hunchback of Notre Dame starring Lon Chaney, and he died in 1938. George, Valentino's manager, died in 1975. In fact, on the original documents for this building, they even list Sidney Ullman's occupation. So I'm not sure who mixed up the Ullman fellas, but ever since they did, it's been a very lazy copy and paste that is on every real estate blog out there. And as for the DeMille aspect, there's just no proof anywhere whatsoever. For some reason, rumors always attach themselves to these old buildings, and they usually involve Valentino, DeMille, Mary Pickford, and of course Marilyn Monroe. And look, if you can prove me wrong, go for it. I would actually love to see proof that DeMille had any involvement with this building. But there are records that show Sidney Ullman owning it first, and the overall price tag cost him $75,000 to bring Frank Webster's Spanish colonial revival vision to fruition. This feels a little creepy, pressing my phone up to a fence, especially when someone could walk out at any second. I was hoping we could, I don't know, maybe catch a glimpse of the inside, but if you want to check it out, there is a great coffee table book that was released in 2016 called the Villa Bonita. It's mostly just photographs. You can see the lobby, and you can actually see inside some of the actual units, as well as some of the residents who were living in the building at the time. Some of them, they were long-term residents, like Francis, a former dance teacher who at the time had been living in the building for 43 years. And some of them had just moved in, like Judith, a model who I believe had only been living here for a few months. The photos in the book, they're absolutely terrific, but it's mostly just that, photos. There aren't too many stories, and it doesn't really dive into anyone's life, which, hey, I mean, that's pretty fitting for a lot of Hollywood buildings. I lived in a huge building when I first moved to LA, not that far from here, just a few blocks, and I would see all sorts of young people, old people, some you talked to, some you didn't, some neighborly, some complete strangers. That book, it came out 9 years ago, so who knows how many of the people featured in the book still live here, but you know me, I'm way more interested in the people who used to live here. One of the very first Villa Bonita residents was Emma Dunn, a character actress who became known for playing mothers. She was born on February 26, 1875 in England, and she started her acting career on the London stage before making her way to Broadway. Ironically, her very first film, which she made way back in 1914, was called Mother. She actually went back and forth from film to theater in the 20s, but once she moved into this building in the 1930s, her film career really took off, and she worked consistently through 1948, retiring in her early 70s. And boy, her resume is very long. She appeared in some great classics and worked with, some of Hollywood's biggest and best. In 1932, she worked with Joan Crawford in the film Letty Linton, and with Bette Davis in Hell's House. Emma, she also appeared in Charlie Chaplin's 1940 film, The Great Dictator, as well as a movie that I absolutely love called I Married a Witch, starring the gorgeous, brilliant Veronica Lake, which came out in 1942. Emma became so associated with playing mothers that, I don't know, I think she took the role a little too seriously. She once told the press that women who don't have children are not only underdeveloped, but are basically living a pointless life. Yeah, I don't think Miss Dunn and I would have gotten along very well. No thanks. But she lived a long life, passing away here in LA at the age of 91 on December 14th, 1966. My my birthday is March 21st. Same as Madeline Jones's, but she was born in 1917 in Sally, South Carolina. And while attending college in South Carolina, she entered a contest to play a character on a CBS radio show. She won it and loved the gig so much that she actually took the character's name that she played, Lois Collier, and used it as her own stage name. So the newly named Lois decided to move to Hollywood, where she signed a contract with Universal Pictures. They didn't do much for her, however. She played bit parts, chorus girls, receptionists, models, mostly in B-movies. Stardom pretty much eluded her. She appeared in the papers, mostly for her marriages and divorces. She lived here in the 1930s before getting married to an agent, one who represented one of the Marx Brothers, which, I'm assuming, helped her land probably her most well-known film role in the 1946 Marx Brothers film, A Night in Casablanca. Her big break, I suppose, came in the form of a low-budget TV series called Boston Blackie, a syndicated show that produced 58 episodes that ran from 1951 to 1953. Boston Blackie was a fictional character depicted in books, radio, TV, graphic novels, and film. He was portrayed on film by Lionel Barrymore in The Face in the Fog, starring our dear, dear friend and Hollywood Heights resident, Sina Owen. But in the TV series, the female lead was Lois's. After the series was over, she spent the rest of the 1950s doing guest spots on various television shows before shedding her stage name and retiring for good in 1958, the year after she married a prominent attorney who eventually went on to represent Milton Berle. Now going by Madeline Schreibman, a combination of her birth name and married name, she and her husband bought a home together in Beverly Hills and lived together for almost 40 years until poor Madeline had to be moved to the motion picture country home out in Woodland Hills, where the stars of yesterday and, well, still today, go to spend their final years. Madeline passed away there at the age of 83 on October 27, 1999. Actress and singer Ethelind Terry also called the Villa Bonita home in the late 1930s. She was born back in 1899 in Philadelphia and hit it big when she starred on Broadway in a massive 1927 hit called Rio Rita, produced by the one and only Florence Ziegfeld. making her one of many popular Ziegfeld girls. In fact, the famous Ziegfeld Theater in New York, it kicked off its opening in 1927 with Rio Rita, and it was one of the most successful Broadway shows that year, running just over a year with almost 500 performances, which was a lot for that era of Broadway. After the show closed, Ethelind married a producer, and they made the front page news when they reported $30,000 worth of jewelry missing. Ton of money back then. There was speculation that her husband set it up so that they could cash in on an insurance claim, but that wasn't really ever proven. Better press came her way in 1930 when MGM announced a huge musical movie was in the works. It was called Lord Byron of Broadway, and Ethelind won the female lead. Unfortunately, though, the film was a flop, and she would only make one other film 7 years later in 1937. And her marriage, it only lasted a couple of years. She was divorced a year after her film debut, and she stayed single for almost a decade before marrying an actor named Dick Purcell in 1942. However, that marriage proved to be even shorter than her previous one. The two called it quits the same year they were married. Ethelind, she had done some theater here in LA, but for the most part, she was retired by the time her divorce was final. In the following year, the newspapers reported that the former Ziegfeld girl was now making 60 cents an hour working at an aircraft plant. And how haunting and Sunset Boulevard-like is this? While she was working at the plant, she recognized the security guard because he was the former treasurer for Florence Ziegfeld. The two must have reminisced about the good old days at that plant. Ethelind pretty much disappeared from that point on, eventually leaving LA for Florida, where she passed away in 1984 at the age of 84. Let's look at the growing vines on the north side of the Villa Bonita. Well, I mentioned an actor who lived here named Walter Bacon. Couldn't find any info on him and came across just one blurry photo, but he appeared in hundreds and hundreds of film and television shows from 1921 to 1967 as a professional background extra. Almost all of his appearances, they're uncredited, and he's listed as townsperson or man on street, man in restaurant, whatever. But his credits, they're insane. Citizen Kane, The Great Dictator again, Mary Poppins, My Fair Lady. He did The Lucy Show and even an episode of Star Trek. I'm sure this man worked on every soundstage at every studio, probably had some great stories. He died in 1973 at the age of 82 here in Hollywood. It's not too often that you hear about a Hollywood couple, let alone two actors staying married for 55 years, but Sarah Marshall and Carl Held accomplished that feat. Sarah, she was an English actress born in 1933 in London to English actors Herbert Marshall and Edna Best. Herbert was in two great Bette Davis films, The Letter and The Little Foxes. Edna was in The Ghost and Mrs. Muir and The Man Who Knew Too Much. But Sarah, she began her career as a stage actress, receiving a Best Actress Tony nomination for Goodbye Charlie in 1960. She also appeared on the London stage in 1972 with Lauren Bacall in Applause and Elaine Stritch in The Gingerbread Lady. By this time, she had been married for 8 years to an actor she met when they were in a Broadway play together named Carl Held. He was born in 1931 in New Jersey, and the two of them lived here together while trying to get their film and television careers off the ground. And I mean, they both worked consistently, but neither of them really ever hit it big. However, they both have mile-long resumes that mostly contain small parts and one-episode guest spots on television. Carl, though, had a little more success on television. He did 10 episodes of Perry Mason and is probably most remembered for the 46 episodes he did on the primetime soap opera Falcon Crest. He also had guest roles on Eight is Enough, Charlie's Angels, Scarecrow and Mrs. King, MacGyver, The Jeffersons, honestly, way too many to name. Same with Sarah. She was on Cheers, Heart to Heart, Three's Company. She also had small parts in the movie Dave and the movie Dangerous Minds. But here's a fun fact about her. Her sister Annie was Jack Nicholson's personal assistant for quite some time in the 1980s and 1990s. Sarah, she passed away on January 18th, 2014 at the age of 80. And get this, her widower, Carl, he's still alive. He's 94. And just earlier this year, he posted a tribute to his lovely wife on Facebook. We would probably be here for a month if I mentioned everyone who ever lived in this building. I didn't even mention the music executives, the television writers, the celebrity parents, the comic book artist who died here in 1943, or Billy Wirth, who moved out in 2016 after living here for 25 years, moving in shortly after he played Dwayne in the terrific 80s film The Lost Boys. Almost 100 years worth of tenants, but I cannot end without talking about Jim Thompson. His name, it just doesn't get thrown around with all of the other names of hard-boiled crime authors, as they call them, and it should. The respect for him has grown in the years since he died in an apartment here at the Villa Bonita, but he never hit it big. He was successful, but never enough to be well off financially, and he knew this too. He would tell his wife to save certain things, saying, "One day after I'm dead, I'll be famous." I don't know if I'd call him famous, but his popularity among crime fiction fans has garnered him some extreme praise. A fantastic 1996 book called Savage Art is a biography of Mr. Thompson that I just loved. He was a fascinating man with a fascinating upbringing in Oklahoma, where he was born in 1906 above a jailhouse because his dad was the sheriff. Not just any old sheriff, one who embezzled and had to flee to Mexico on horseback. Some real Wild West outlaw stuff that Jim drew inspiration from when it came time to his writing, which started in his teens. He began writing professionally for true crime magazines before publishing his first novel in 1942, Now and on Earth. Didn't do too well. Not many of his books in the 1940s did. The only way that he earned any money, really, was writing for the tabloids. One of his most revered novels, though, came out in 1952, The Killer Inside Me. Jim saw it turned into a film in 1976 starring Stacy Keach, but he wasn't around to see the 2010 Casey Affleck remake. He had a very good run in the 1950s, releasing over 15 novels. Some of his best work, like Savage Night, A Hell of a Woman, oh, I love that title so much. After Dark My Sweet is another great title. It was adapted into a 1990 movie starring Jason Patric and Rachel Ward. Probably, though, his most recognized title is The Getaway, written in 1958. Made into a movie starring Ali MacGraw and Steve McQueen in 1972, which Jim was around for, but he did not live to see Kim Basinger and Alec Baldwin's version in 1994. A few of his others have been turned into movies, but the one that received the most acclaim was a result of his 1963 novel, The Grifters. He passed away before seeing Angelica Houston and Annette Bening both receive Oscar nominations for their roles opposite John Cusack. Jim Thompson moved to Hollywood in the mid-1950s when director Stanley Kubrick hired him to co-write the screenplay for the 1956 film noir The Killing, starring Sterling Hayden. The two men, they also teamed up the following year to write the screenplay for 1957's Paths of Glory. Once here in Hollywood, though, Jim, he never wanted to live anywhere else. He slowed down a bit in the 1960s, only publishing a handful of novels. To make money, though, he turned to television writing, where he worked on a variety of shows. But in 1970, Robert Redford flew Jim to Utah, where the two men worked on a film script called Beau that unfortunately never got made. With their children grown, Jim and his wife Alberta moved out of their small LA house and into a small apartment here on the second floor over Labor Day weekend in 1974. And Jim chose this part of town so that he could walk to his favorite hangout, Musso and Frank, just a few blocks away on Hollywood Boulevard. His best friend was alcohol, and they could spend all the time they wanted together there. He took all of his meetings there, socially and professionally. Sometimes he would pair it with Musso's famous pot roast and his favorite corner booth. Jim was not the first writer to become a permanent fixture in the world of Musso and Frank, and he will not be the last. The allure of Hollywood's oldest restaurant still pulls. Jim, though, he experienced several strokes in the 1970s and was in and out of hospitals. He did manage to pull off his one and only acting role, however, a small part as a judge in the 1975 neo-noir film Farewell, My Lovely, starring Robert Mitchum. With his alcoholism taking its toll and the multiple strokes, Jim essentially gave up living. He told his wife that he didn't want to eat anymore, and he didn't. He holed up here in his apartment and essentially starved himself to death, passing away on April 7th, 1977. And at the time of his death, all of his novels were out of print, and they wouldn't see a resurgence for several years. Next time you find yourself at Musso and Frank, and please do, raise a glass for Mr. Jim Thompson, a hell of a writer.